Well, hello everyone. My name is Maya and I am BIG's program manager. Delighted here to be joined by Professor Ruth Schmidt and Sarah Kovar. Sarah is BISG co-president this year, so she will introduce our speaker. Again, warm welcome to everyone. Thank you for joining us. Sarah, take it away.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Maya. As Maya mentioned, my name is Sarah Kovar, and I am the co-president of the Behavioral Insights Student Group. I am a second year at the Design Engineering program between GSD and Cs. It is with great honor that I get to introduce our speaker for today. Ruth Schmidt is a personal hero of mine, and I count myself so fortunate to have been able to work with her early in my personal development. Ruth is an associate professor at the Institute of Design at Illinois Institute of Technology. Her work sits at the intersection of behavioral economics and humanity-centered design, combining strategic design methodologies and behavioral insights to inform effective ethical solutions for complex system challenges. Prior to this, she was a senior leader at Dublin, an innovation consultancy within Deloitte, which is where we met, and where she led the development of applied behavioral and design methodologies to help our clients develop innovative solutions and embed innovation processes more effectively within their organizations across healthcare, financial services, education, and civic domains. She's really done everything. She has a master's in design strategy from the Institute of Design. And one of my favorite random project facts about Ruth is that she worked with CFPB, which in America is our Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, to create an illustrated financial well-being book for children. So she's done amazing, really fascinating work across a multitude of fields. So really excited to have Ruth speak with us here today. Thank you so much, Ruth.
Oh, it's absolutely my pleasure. And it's always great to see Sarah, and I appreciate your having me here today. I'm really looking forward to sort of talking with the group and bringing a design lens to what I think is a really interesting continued conversation about behavioral design and behavioral science. So what I might do is share my screen and kind of get us started. There we go. So as Sarah said, I'm a designer. I'm not a trained behavioral scientist from the get-go, but I've been working in the behavioral design and behavioral science field for about 13 years now. So starting right around the time, actually, that books like Nudge and Predictably Irrational came out. And what is always funny to me is when I look back, and of course, the first thing you do when you're interested in things often is you Google it. And back then, 2008-ish, if you Googled behavioral economics, as it was normally called, and design, very little came up. There was really not a whole lot of activity. Contrast that with now, where you look at that and there are not only dedicated companies, there are obviously Nobel Prize winners in our mix, there are all sorts of training capacities. So the field itself is really taken off. However, it is still fairly new. It's a fairly new field, right? So part of what I would like to explore today, it's a little heady to say like this is the future, because some of these conversations are actually already happening. But what I'd like to talk about a bit is what does it look like if we start to expand on what behavioral design currently does? What are some of the things, some of the conversations that are already occurring, most specifically around how systems design can play a significant and important role in what it is that we're doing. So with that, to kind of kick it off, I realize it's a hard act to follow, I know, and I recognize that Richard Thaler spoke to hopefully many of you were in the audience yesterday. Obviously, a big name. Sarah was very kind about my intro, but it's a lot easier than Dr. Thaler. He has a lot more going on. But what I think is really interesting, and this is a quote from a special issue that just came out recently, is that he's also, right? So this isn't just me talking about how being more integrated into systems is important. I think one of the evolutions of this field really is that there are different types of problems that behavioral scientists and behavioral designers might be solving some of which really are about starting earlier in the process, that it's not just about nudges or even this notion of addressing sludge within existing systems, but what if we were helping to create those systems themselves? That's kind of a starting point, I think, for what I'm quite interested in. And so it's interesting to kind of think about, well, what does that actually mean, and what are the limitations right now? So what does it even mean to introduce a potential systems lens? So like I was kind of saying, there is so much amazing progress that has been made in the past 12, 13 years. I'm certainly not going to read out all of these things, but in both civic environments and governments, in commercial spaces, this is just a small smattering of companies, Google, Microsoft, Morningstar. We even have kind of dedicated companies that are growing out of a lot of behavioral insights, like Lemonade, the insurance app, for example. There's deeper and deeper integration into commercial and civic enterprises themselves. So the notion that it's not just about kind of nudging as a sideline, but this real appreciation for what that looks like internally is not only doing a lot of sort of positive good for solutions, but it's also, I think, growing just general interest in the field. Right. So now if you do the Google search again, a lot more turns up, but you also have things like training programs. You have academic programs as well that are significant draws. So there is a ton of groundwork set. There's a lot going on. All of that is also like completely amazing. One of the other things that can happen when a field is at a stage of maturity like this is also that there are certain limitations that can be kind of built in. And one way that I'd like to think about it, and this is not just me, I've actually had conversations with folks across a variety of sort of roles. Michael Halsworth, in fact, and I have talked exactly about this. And there was a really interesting set of articles, I think it was about 3 years ago now, in the journal Behavioral Public Policy that dealt with exactly this. We're sort of at this crossroads where, to a certain extent, when you get really good at solving certain kinds of problems, it can mean that those are the problems that you now are known for solving. And it can lead to this sort of tension, vicious cycle, where the things that you get introduced to doing are mainly because you've demonstrated really good success at those in the past. But it can also serve as a bit of a limitation for what are the types of things that are going to be good to be looking at and solving for, that you may actually have a lot to contribute to the conversation, but are a little bit trickier because those are no longer in your wheelhouse. And in fact, I'll talk about this a little bit more further on, but I've been having some really interesting working sessions and conversations with Ideas 42. And Piyush Tantia, who's the Chief Innovation Officer there, has been saying exactly this, that some of the things that Ideas 42 would love to be involved in are kind of perceived as a misfit because they're not necessarily what they're known for. So it is a genuine challenge. And again, the things that behavioral science is doing right now are so good and so powerful. But what it can do is to leave a couple of things out. So for example, one of the reasons why I think systems are so interesting and important in this space is that when we're looking at things like impact, sometimes those go beyond what can be measured, for example, in an RCT, because there is a longer term impact that we're even looking for. So a randomized control trial can get us immediate results. We may not yet know what the results and the impact may be longer term. We can also, generalizability is kind of a known issue with the field right now. How do we extrapolate and sort of understand patterns across different elements? Part of that is even just looking at the evidence that we have, right? So there are ways in which the evidence itself and what is measurable get interrupted. What's interesting to me, I think most importantly, is in the bottom left here. What are the problems that we're even concerned with addressing? There are so many interesting challenges that I think behavioral insights can benefit that may not be on the table right now. And what that also contributes to is, where do we look for input and insight? What are the fields that we look to that can be helpful, that sort of inform what it is that we do, that don't just optimize what we're already doing well, but kind of feed bigger, not just impact, but different types of methods. So with that as kind of a grounding point, we're at, again, this interesting inflection point, really great at certain things, still trying to figure out what is next. The way that I wanted to organize my time with you today is to kind of think about this in for of systems approach, designing in systems, designing for systems, and the design of systems. Because these sort of, I would say, provide a little bit, maybe a roadmap or so of what we might be thinking about, because we're doing elements of all these things already, but what that looks like can help us to understand how can we harness current trends and momentum that help us to do it better. So I realize I'm using the word systems and systems design a lot. So I wanted to pause just momentarily, because even that small word can mean a lot of different things. This is a little bit of a goofy picture, but one of my favorite definitions of systems, this is due to Draper Kaufman, give credit, is if you think about a cow, the reason that you know that a cow is a system is because if you slice him in half, you don't get two cows. You get hamburger. you lose the essence of what a cow is and what a cow does and sort of all the things that make it a literal cow that eats grass and contributes milk, et cetera. So a system is not just a set of parts. It's not just a bunch of independent components. It really is this notion of having an integral set of interoperable functions and different components and conditions that all work together. So when I'm talking about systems design and systems, I think that's kind of one important consideration, is that we are thinking about not just solving for individual parts and pieces, but what are the ripple effects? What does that actually look like in a more comprehensive way? So when we talk about systems, an important component of that is this notion of context, right? That's actually a very important consideration and principle in behavioral design, is that we're not just designing for specific solutions, but we have to understand context. And even this, I love this quote, partially because even here, right, we can talk about the importance of context, but even that is a little bit fraught. We don't always recognize the different implications of context. And here again, we sort of introduce that generalizability challenge of what are the ways in which context helps us to design in certain parts, but what are the things that we maybe lose in the details? How do we take from experiments, which are incredibly insightful and important, and recognize that the internal validity that those show may not match the external validity of the context we are designing into? So that tension between recognizing context and designing for it is kind of key, I think, in part to designing in systems. We need to understand those contexts that we're designing into. I realize it's easy to use COVID as an example. I will do it here on and off just because it provides some sort of, again, recognizable kind of present tense things that we can be discussing. So if we're thinking about context, what does that look like? What does that mean? Obviously, behavioral change, mask wearing is a really important part of what we recognize now as reducing viral spread. It's essential to doing that. I think that's sort of now been the aerosolized nature of the virus. It makes it clear that that's a very important component. And when we think about what that means, wearing a mask as a behavioral change mechanism, there are studies that I don't need to even point you to. You can sort of look these all up, right? There have been many different approaches towards thinking about the right combination of characteristics and the right, call them nudges or just behavioral prompts. So sometimes it's just a matter of getting access. There's all sorts of information, for example, what are the right forms of data. Seeing qualitative data and quantitative data and stories and anecdotes all feed our sense of what is good or right to do. Pro-social norms, so all of these, right? There are different ways in which we can think about specific behavioral strategies to identify and work on this particular problem. And that all makes a ton of sense. But it is, again, a bit more complex. We are not just looking at wearing a mask as an isolated incident. We are looking at that really in the context of many separate, important other contextual forces that are going on. And again, I don't think any of these in particular are new, right? We've been living with this virus for a long time at this point. But many of these system forces may be impacting what we think about being the right thing to do. And even like what are inconveniences that when we know the right thing, we still don't. So even here, for example, in the bottom left, like just the visceral, I live in Chicago and it happens to be like 80 degrees today, and masks are not comfortable when it's 80 degrees, right? It was actually kind of okay when it was the winter time. People worry about maskne, right? Don't ever underestimate the importance of designing for vanity. All of these things are very critically important and different forces and contextual elements that we need to be designing for. So this is true just in a general way, but it also gets even more complex. And this notion of designing in systems has to recognize even the broader systems that we are living in, not just designing for. So again, when we think about wearing a mask, that is broadly considered to be a smart public health thing to do. It protects you, it protects others, all those good reasons. We also have data that shows that Black and brown populations are maybe more particularly vulnerable to COVID-19 effects. That is due to a bunch of different reasons, because many people may be in service jobs, for example, and just the populations there are suffering at greater degrees in contrast with their percentage of the population. So you could say, well, okay, that's just a matter of sort of making sure that that population hears these messages more or is sort of more attuned. And yet the system that we live in here in the US, and especially we're only a week out from the George Floyd, Derek Chauvin trial, which clearly indicated that it is not a neutral act to be Black in the United States. And especially for Black men, wearing a mask, and I don't know if you can see on the screen here, like wearing a mask as sort of a public health issue, but also a matter of staying alive, because if you wear a mask, you may be more likely to be harassed by police. So this sounds very sort of doom and gloom. There's a lot that we need to be looking at, designing for. The reason I mention all this is because this notion of designing in systems is both critical and also just complicated. We can't fix things, but if we're not recognizing the importance of them, we're not sufficiently designing for the right problems. We can also, sort of expanding on that, recognize that not only is it about the different types of individuals and what we bring to the table in terms of what is contextually right there, but even as designers, our sense of what right is can be quite personal and quite biased. And as behavioral designers, I think we kind of know this, right? We know that humans are biased. That is part of the deal. But we may not realize that to the full extent that we need to. And I use this as an example, just even of what good health is. There are very clear sort of characteristics, scientifically speaking, about certainly good health being the absence of disease. But when you ask somebody if they are in good health, you will get different responses based on who they are and what their expectations are and where they have been. I did some user research, for example, a number of years ago, and we were talking to this very nice woman. She was probably in her 60s. She had, I don't know, 3, 4, 5, like significant chronic illnesses. She had COPD and heart disease, and was wearing oxygen cannula all the time. And we asked her, like, what's a bad day for you physically? And she looked at us kind of surprised, and she's like, oh, I don't really have bad days. So it's an example of, to us, like, obviously, like, objectively speaking, she was not in good health, but her sense of that was quite personal and quite different. And we also can add on to that the fact that there are, for example, you've maybe heard of food deserts. There's a similar conversation going on now about fitness deserts, right? So I always cringe a little bit when I hear about studies that use going to the gym as a proxy for like maintaining good health, because that's a very kind of upper middle class, sort of urbanish way of thinking about what health is. And there may be cases where that is desirable, but simply not present. So again, this notion of context being kind of broad and diverse and recognizing where our own sensibilities may be getting in the way. And we need to recognize both what is realistic, but also how do we solve these problems in a slightly different level. So a lot of what I was just describing may be somewhat familiar. Those are kind of these design in systems that we're already doing. Pivoting now a little bit into designing for systems, which to me speaks to a little bit more of a sort of active or almost aggressive role. Like, what are we designing specifically for, not just recognizing the systems are there passively, but actually actively designing for them, there are a few different ways that we can think about that. And one of the challenges of this, I would say, is that systems themselves tend not to be stable. They don't stick around in the way that we think they're going to. We can design something which works well initially that may not work over time. So I've started to sort of think of these in terms of like, how do we avoid the brittleness in solutions and how do we create more resilient ones? We talked a little bit already, or I did, about this notion of value, right? That what is valuable to different people or different populations may be quite variable. And therefore, what we think about a solution that may work in one place may be brittle elsewhere because it doesn't speak to a new set of folks. We can also look at these other two characteristics of what brittle solutions sometimes manifest. One is that we don't recognize the changes over time. So again, in this COVID world that we live in, right, this system has changed radically. I would say most recently by the introduction of vaccines and vaccination. That has really shifted the terms of the conversation that we are having. So this notion of persistence over time is something that we should be at least considering. And then the stability of systems themselves. We are not always designing into a stable system. And I should also say, it's not to imply that stability isn't necessarily a good thing. Sometimes instability can actually be quite useful when we have a stable system that's held together, that's sort of giving power to certain things that need to be disrupted. But this notion of kind of persistent stability is also an issue too. So here wanted to describe a little bit about what are some strategies that we might use that build from futures and foresight, not as some kind of predictive mechanism. So this is not about predictive analytics, but how do we even conceive of what it is that is the right thing to be solving for, and what are some disciplines that we can borrow from? So this notion of the futures cone is kind of built up over a number of different thinkers and kind of characteristics. When we think about sort of the projected future, there's a little, that's basically just where we see that sight line going, right? We sort of have a sense of what's happening. The likelihood of that happening is in some ways pretty slim because it's only one example out of many. But the notion of probable futures can be kind of useful. And this is often the way one thinker who's often associated with this, Herman Kahn, who worked with the Rand Corporation, for example, this was like back in the 60s, took game theory and military strategy and had these notions about futures based on what is probable. So how do we take likelihoods and help us to think differently about what we might plan for? So that's definitely useful. There's also the notion of preferred futures, which may exist outside of the probable ones, but they are still kind of preferred and interesting. And one of the thinkers that's known here, Gaston Berger, who developed, he was French. This is a very French way of thinking, I guess, this idea of sort of preferred. It's also a very designerly way of thinking, if you will, in that it's sort of optimistic about what we might create, not what exists. But he developed this sort of manner of thinking called la prospective, which is about kind of what are the potentials? What are these preferred things that we might do? So sort of what should be is another way of thinking about the future and how do we design towards that? We then have what may be the most relevant, I think, to this conversation, which is this notion of plausible futures. So it's not what's gonna happen or even likely to happen, but what's a plausible set of circumstances that we may need to consider. And this notion of scenario planning, which is now fairly common and it's integrated into business strategy, sort of plays with this idea of plausibility. So the ways in which we might think about designing for things is really about expanding our sense of options, but being concrete and crisp about that. Because it's not just sort of brainstorming, but it's actually sort of being systematic about how we go ahead. This notion of the futures cone, by the way, it does open even further. And the reason why this is kind of interesting is because things may actually bounce around. So the notion of like space travel at one point sat in preposterous, but now it's sort of moved up. So obviously it doesn't stay in one place all the time. So one thing that I've started to find interesting, and this is from a paper that just came out fairly recently, is creating a bit of more systematic thinking. I'm calling it behavioral planning just as a riff on scenario planning. But what does it look like if we start to take this same sensibility and the same lens about what are plausible things that might happen? And one kind of piece of this that I think is useful and important is it also situates behavioral interventions as not just sort of fixed in time and you throw that into a system and then it just sort of does its thing. There is interaction both ways. An intervention acts on a system, but systems can interact on that intervention itself. So in this model, which again, is just sort of used, I wouldn't say it delivers any kind of answer, but it can provide a little bit more sensibility about what are considerations that we might need to be designing for. So if we think about adaptation on one axis, and then kind of where are the conditions being set, either top down as sort of human created or some that just appear organically, it can start to help us think about like, what is the set of things that we need to be addressing? So if we think about, for example, how policies and other incentives impact interventions, one of my favorite examples there, the Colorado River Basin was having a water shortage issue, and they created some interventions to help farmers, intended to help farmers sort of reduce their water usage. It ran straight smack into a set of use it or lose it policies, in which case, if you didn't use water, then there was less that you were going to have access to later. So that's kind of like one of these clear examples of a tension between policies. We also see this all over COVID, right? Where there are all sorts of different policies that may be slightly conflicting or contradictory that change the way that we need to understand our system. Changing boundaries of problems is a really interesting element too, and this is taking that longitudinal view. One interesting example to me, for example, is that the gig economy is shifting how we even think about things like retirement, right? It used to be that if there was, and this again is maybe more specific to the US, 401ks, programs like Save More Tomorrow are great. They're also designed to be specific to certain types of conditions, certain types of employment conditions. So how do we actually understand what we're solving for? Moving lower right, situational factors might even just be due to things like the nice weather, right? There's this recognition that when it's nicer, people go outside. New Year's resolutions kind of sit there too, these sort of environmental factors. And second order issues, I think, are a really interesting place where we maybe don't always pay sufficient attention. There's a lot of the sort of COVID second order issues that are coming out, for example, mental health issues or even domestic violence. There is also, and this is something that I recognize as somebody now in academia, that's critically important too. Women, for example, are sort of losing ground professionally because they are now taking on caretaking roles that they didn't before. With taking care of children in-house. A second aspect of designing for solutions is the notion of how do we use data? And data is not a new piece of the conversation, right? There's a lot around data analytics and algorithms and AI. And there are a couple of things that I sort of like this quote specifically that it kind of starts to tease out. One is the nature of data itself, but even more specifically maybe is how it points us to the problem or the right problem to be solving. So I use as an example here, this is an illustrative from Flint. So Flint, Michigan, people may be familiar with, for example. There is, it arose from actually economic conditions where there was the desire to save money. There were certain sort of water sources that were re-siphoned and ended up creating this enormously significant sustainability and ecological disaster really among Flint residents. So the notion of what to solve here, the reason I like using this as an example is that this was actually a target application, a target source for when the Obama administration stood up the behavioral science, social and behavioral science team. They went in here and they helped to think about, well, what are ways in which we can shift behavioral change? It's a little bit more complex, though, obviously, than behavioral change. We know now, for example, that lawsuits have contributed, they resulted in fairly big money that is still going to get distributed amongst the citizens. But when we think about behavior change, we may frame what it is even that we're solving for in a certain kind of specific way. Whereas if we're thinking about the systemic inequalities that are part of this system, it really sets up two competing narratives. So the reason I introduce this is just this sense of when we framing, not in the behavioral science term of the word, but in more of the kind of problem framing term of the word, creates new realities. It creates ways that we think about both what we're solving for, but also what are possible solutions. There's an excellent book called Frame Reflection by Donald Schoen and Howard Rhine that sort of speaks to this specifically. So how we even set up what it is that we're solving for, what we know of data can help us to point towards some of these things, but it's also recognizing that the narrative piece of problem solving is equally critical and equally important. Another aspect of data, though, that I think is absolutely sort of fundamentally tied to the recent conversations around algorithms and AI is what data is even included. So this is a very stark reminder. D+ is not good. And just even the term data genocide is like very stark. That the fact that there is a lot of data that does not exist for understanding the COVID implications, for example, on Native Americans and Native populations. When we're trying to make policy and we're trying to make decisions based on data, and this is something that the field is already talking about, I don't think this is entirely new, but when we're looking at the data that is helping us to create solutions, we also need to be recognizing what data is not in the mix. What are the ways in which what's not present is actually an equally important part of the puzzle that we need to be solving for. There's a really excellent book, Automating Inequality by Virginia Eubanks, that kind of digs into this specifically in looking at public policy and systems and the way in which data provides, in some cases, sort of attempts at really good problem solving, but also skews the picture. So she has one potentially kind of really touching example in child welfare, where using public data, for example, and public and civic infrastructure to think about, well, what is it we need to be solving for? A couple of things arise from that. One is a variation on this challenge that we see in terms of Native Indians and Native Americans, which is that if you're not in the picture, your data is not there. So people on public services, their data is there. People who are able to financially provide for their challenges are not even in that system, right? So there's this automatic skew about who matters or who counts or who may be penalized. It also is really interesting how the same indicators, oddly enough, that are used to create leading metrics that indicate child welfare issues are also indicative of poverty. If your child does not, comes to school in dirty clothes or is left alone for a certain amount of time, those are used equally to show that there may be child welfare issues, whereas they may just be an indication that that it's a child living in a poverty, in a household with poverty. It also is interesting that it can help it indicates the slant that sometimes if we start to believe data more than we'll believe our own judgment, we can customize our judgment to meet that data. So the whole conversation around how we think about and use data as we're creating interventions is complicated. It is a balance, and I think recognizing where data is useful, where the data analysis can help us to see new things and help us see new patterns, but also not giving up our own agency about being able to decide what is useful and using our own judgment about being able to tease that apart. I know that there's the book Noise, for example, which is coming out fairly soon, which I'm looking forward to reading because it's I'm hoping that it teases apart some of this complexity as well. And then finally, wanted to talk a little bit, and this is probably the most open-ended of the set. We're designing in systems already. I think we're increasingly thinking about designing for systems. Designing systems themselves is kind of a whole other discipline, which is still, it's actually complicated because even systems design is made up of like multiple various fields in some ways. But when we think about how behavioral science may become incorporated into the design of systems and take on that role, it begs again sort of a different way, potentially in some different vocabulary and ways that we may be thinking about things. So this is from a piece that I wrote a couple of years ago by now, but it seems to always be useful to me and to others. This sort of dual axis of where to play and how to win is actually, again, taken from business strategy. I'm showing my consultant roots here. But the way that we can think about the use of this is where behavioral science and design can be complementary. And obviously, like any framework or model, it's vastly oversimplified. Behavioral science tends to excel. It is so very good at things like dealing with individuals or shifting inputs. So for this, I consider things like hiring mechanisms that, or blinded auditions with the orchestra, right? I know Richard Thaler actually mentioned that yesterday too, where we can strip out how incoming inputs are coming to us so we can debias and try to reduce the likelihood of kind of being swayed in ways that are not healthy or not equitable. The further up we go, the more systemic our solutions become and the more we're envisioning the new. So kind of moving from solving problems to identifying opportunities, that's actually where design is quite good. And what is a little bit false, I think, about this diagram is it makes it seem like there are two turfs. I would actually think of it much more as a gradient. And I do feel like, as somebody who works in design but has a foot in behavioral science as well, the things that these two systems, or these two disciplines rather, can feed to one another have such interesting potential, and especially around thinking about what it takes to design systems and how we might integrate those. One actually really interesting illustration that probably sits a little bit more in the top right than the bottom left, just as an example, if you're all familiar with the app and the sort of the new offering Lemonade, which I mentioned a bit earlier, I think is one of the, I would love it if people had other examples, because I feel like I always fall back on that one a little bit too much because it's quite good, of really uncovering and creating new ways of thinking about how to not just solve problems, but to really create opportunities in a different kind of way. So they have very successfully kind of reframed what insurance even feels like and looks like, which is no easy feat given how much insurance companies are reviled in general for sort of being takers and not givers. So this notion, and here again, I'm sort of situating it in COVID-19, because I do think that there are some very interesting ways in which this, as I like to say, this accidental field experiment kind of opened up our sensibility to why we really benefit from the very analytical, more quantitative, more rigorous domains of behavioral science, really basing it in a scientific discipline that design, frankly, has always suffered from a deficit of. There are two different problem-solving methodologies, so I don't think they should or could be smushed together, but they both actually benefit one another in very interesting ways because they both have very different strengths. Where behavioral science can instill rigor and kind of comprehensiveness and the sense of precision and measurability that design is frankly not good at. There is a certain something about how design can think more into more ambiguous or sometimes what are called more wicked problems. And also, I think I used this word optimism before, the sense of what could be. There's a very interesting example. Sendhil Mullainathan, who I know was at Harvard for quite some time, he's now at University of Chicago, and he spoke at a lecture at Booth a couple of years ago, and he was describing this solution called Becoming a Man. And this was from, I think, the Urban Poverty Lab, where basically Chicago's south and west sides, there's a lot of gang violence, a lot of also poverty, and there's a pretty wide population of young men in particular who are likely to sort of get into trouble if they're not kind of, if the conditions are poor. It's just sort of easier to sort of go down the path of least resistance and end up in places you don't want to. And there is this Becoming a Man program is essentially sort of cognitive behavioral therapy. It's the closest I can think of, sort of a self-regulating opportunity where people are sort of taught to recognize their own symptoms that they might slip into kind of violent or provocative behavior. And so Sendhil Mullainathan described this example, and I still remember very clearly, he sort of described it as like, kind of crazy, but it works sort of thing. There was this sense of like, it was a little bit of an odd, surprising solution that struck me as so interesting, because I think it's exactly one of those situations where clearly the sense of being able to use those sort of slow down, self-regulating kind of positive friction elements did not necessarily come from behavioral design, but still had such a powerful impact on this kind of problem solving. So it even accidentally, that struck me as this very interesting intersection of what it takes to make connections between potential solutions that may not make sense on paper, but can actually have real world significant impact. So as we're thinking about that, I think sort of opening back up to what design of systems can look like, increasingly one concept that I think is going to be more and more important is this notion of what I am calling now choice infrastructure, as distinct from choice architecture, which is really thinking about kind of the undercurrents, the underlying elements of what it takes to do things. When Thaler was speaking last night, for example, he introduced this notion, I think he called it like financial addresses almost. Like, to me, that's a choice infrastructure solution. If you're going to, he was using it in the context of being able to sort of push money back and forth, for example, if for your taxes, you don't have to file taxes. There's something which essentially serves as a mailing address, but for finances. Choice infrastructure can create this set of systemic connections. It's the same way that we have, connectivity. That's an infrastructural solution that allows for certain things. And I think that's a very interesting place where behavioral science could play in recognizing what can we build on, what are those infrastructural elements that can help us to be smarter and to create solutions that can be more scalable, because that is something that system solutions can do as well. Kind of coming out of that, and this is very early thinking, but it's helping me at least to get my head around what are some of the ways in which that impacts the way we currently solve problems with what we might solve next. On the left, we talk all the time about solving for context, solving for users, solving for behavior. Some sort of more sort of an evolution, I would say, of what that might look like is that if we're thinking about conditions rather than context, or in addition to, not instead of, that's sort of like this sense of being able to be more fluid about what we're designing for, and the fact that conditions underlie all sorts of different elements of a system. The conditions are what allow systems to happen. In some ways, those are kind of that infrastructural piece that allow things to continue. It's not just the backdrop, it's sort of an active sense. The notion of agents, in addition to users, is coming out of, I won't get into a whole post-structuralist thing, but essentially when we think about things besides humans having power, that lends itself, it's almost in some ways what choice architecture is already doing. We recognize that things in the environment surrounding us have a great deal of impact on what it is that we do. One example that I like to use there is that, for example, if you hear a conversation behind a closed door, that door is not neutral. The fact that that door is closed implies that it's private. It implies that that is not a place for you to go in. So in some ways, like, that door is imbued with agency in a way that we don't always think about it. So in systems conversations and systems design, that tends to be kind of a critical concept as well. What else has agency and might hold power? And then finally, sort of evolving behavior into the notion of interactions sort of naturally evolves from the nature of systems, right? Where we can be looking at behavior, but it's really how those behaviors connect, how those relationships take place that can lend themselves to what we actually need to be sort of considering and designing for and measuring as we're thinking about what solutions are. So one just sort of last couple of thoughts before I turn it back over to Sarah. All of this grand vision, still very unformed. I think there is a lot yet to be done in terms of how to consider how to design for systems and what that takes. That said, I am very solidly convinced that it's not a single discipline that is going to do that well. The sense of being able to sort of pull in a transdisciplinary way from different disciplines is going to be important to that, not just because it brings different disparate opinions together, but also, thinking about a quote like this, for example, it sort of comes full circle, right? There are certain things that behavioral science does extraordinarily well, but if those become kind of the wall that we build around a certain discipline, it means that we lose a ton of opportunity to solve problems differently and to think differently. There's no shortage of research these days that diversity, right? Diverse opinions put together actually lead to much better and more interesting outcomes. I think this is a perfect example of that. And it's also, I think, where we are as a field right now. So this is a bit of a generic sort of arc. Although what was interesting as I was thinking about this is that design thinking followed a very similar path. So in some ways, behavioral science is kind of just following suit. Starts out as sort of cocktail party novelty, then it becomes the fix-all, the silver bullet. People realize that's not true and was never even possible. So, now it's sort of dismissed, then increasingly clarity of value gets established. And I think where the field is right now in terms of behavioral design is really pretty far along. I think there is this urge to consider how it can be a real capability and integrating that capability into organizations. Where we are now that becomes sort of an interesting divergence, though, is that when you get to that point, there's also this tendency for democratization, where it's not just about who got trained in a PhD program, but now, for example, there's no shortage of training opportunities where it's like become a behavioral scientist in 6 easy sessions kind of thing. That can, as somebody who's a designer who recognizes that there is a lot of opportunity for people to become design thinkers in 5 minutes, can feel really tense because that can sometimes feel like it's devaluing where the field is going. I actually think it's a really interesting spot to be. It does require considering and thinking about like what are criteria for what good looks like. There are going to be opportunities where somebody takes a short course, puts out a shingle, and may not yet be equipped with what their sort of true, with the real talent or notion about being able to solve really good problems well. But sometimes that is okay. In the same way that you don't need a doctor to put on a Band-Aid, you may not need a professional behavioral scientist to do everything. But it is, I think, increasingly introducing this conversation about what is in and what's out. And in some ways, this is I should have used a cow. This is like the parable of the elephant where everyone feels a different part of the elephant. So the flank is like a wall and the trunk is like a snake, et cetera. One of the reasons that these guys are all separate and all have different perspectives is because they're not talking to one another. I do think that as we continue to become, and I would hope that there is this openness to transdisciplinarity, that can help this conversation to become more connected, benefiting from different modes of thinking, and not giving up what the field is already doing super well. I think that is something which I always want to make clear, that it's not about reducing good problem solving, it's about opening it up to new kinds. And we already see some interesting, and this is the last slide, and then we'd love to hear from others. There is this really interesting set of conversations even, and this is sort of in that spirit of democratization. Where do we pull in different types of expertise and even recognize we're humans who are the biggest experts in their own sensibility? Where can we pull in their sort of knowledge, and how do we create opportunities to both leverage but also learn and lean on? What are the ways in which different people are bringing different expertise to this? So that's that's it. A lot of information at a fairly high level, but I think hoping that sort of seeds some interesting thinking about where it is that we may be going and kind of what are the opportunities for how to think about systems from a broader perspective.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Ruth. This was brilliant. We have a lot of great questions that are coming in through the Q&A box. So folks, if you have questions, please feel free to jump in at any point. So the first question that we have here is from Barbara, who's asking, how would we define the limits of systems so that we don't end up mapping something too wide or too narrow to find a productive intervention point?
Yeah, no, and that is a wonderful question. It is actually something which I think falls under, to a certain extent, that notion of problem framing. And it's funny that actually that particular question, I am running a research class with some of my graduate students right now, where we're trying to essentially think about, well, what could a new discipline be? Not to be too grand about it, but how do we combine behavioral science, behavioral design, and systems thinking? And in some ways, that particular question, I think, is one of the biggest challenges, is recognizing how do we not, there's that notion of like boiling the ocean to find a solution. How do we not do that? How do we make sure that we are solving for that right level of problem? Part part of it, I think, is the recognition that we still can and should be solving for things that are bounded. So like recognizing and having, not shirking on that, that problem framing phase of a project. Too often, what can happen is that people leap into problem solving right away without even recognizing like, what is it that we are solving for? So it's not a perfect answer to that, but I think there is a great deal of deliberateness about recognizing what is it that we are solving for, but also what are the different lenses that we need to be addressing. So there may be certain behavioral aspects of what to solve for. We also need to recognize kind of what are the systemic implications of that. Most of the time as designers, we're actually beholden to a client, right? We tend not to just solve problems because they're fun. It's because somebody has asked us to. And sometimes they have their own motivations as well. So one way to think about answering that question is that it's a bit of a conversation, and recognizing kind of where are feasible boundaries about where we can and should be solving, and then recognizing what does sit outside of that, but that we may need to at least kind of keep on our radar, because dismissing it may mean that we're forgetting about certain elements or certain forces that we need to be sort of addressing and being more thoughtful about. So I think it's a great question. I don't have a perfect answer for it, because I actually think like in problem solving generally, that is often the hardest thing to do is to figure out like what to carve out. So yeah, that's incredibly important.
Yes, definitely. I feel like I face that all the time. Where is that line between too narrow and too broad? Another question we have here is from Keith. When you've got behavioral scientists and designers working together on a shared problem or opportunity, what have you found to be the most effective way to align them so that they can work well together?
Yeah, that is a wonderful question. And one of the reasons I love it is because some of my best professional relationships have been with people who think very differently than I do. So absolutely, I think that's a very valid sort of thing to worry about, because when we do come from different disciplines and we bring different ways of thinking, there is this natural tendency to have a certain amount of tension, like you're doing it wrong, or no, this is the way we should do that. I think one of the most important things, and it's actually in some ways, it's sort of the project equivalent of problem framing maybe, is to get, even from the get-go, we often focus on post-mortems at the end of a project. I actually think there's a huge benefit, and I don't know if it's a pre-mortem, getting aligned before we even start problem solving, to recognize where there are boundaries and limitations of our own knowledge and of the way that we think about problem solving well. And this may be kind of an obvious piece of it too. I think a deep respect for the people that you are working with who don't come from your discipline. When I said earlier that some of my best working relationships are with people who don't think like me, what I loved about it is that it forced each of us, because we respected one another highly, to be really deliberate and to be really, sometimes I use this term positive friction, to push back on like, I don't understand why you're saying that that's, the way to go. Help me understand that. So considering it a true dialogue, there's also, I think, sometimes this added complexity that recognizing what is the right thing at the right time. I've often found, for example, that design as a means to sort of help craft hypotheses is sometimes sort of more digestible or understandable, because it's a place in which we are naturally being a bit more divergent. So letting design, for example, take a certain amount of the lead, if you will, in terms of process there. When it comes to developing solutions, like maybe there are different disciplines that take the lead. So there's, I think, strong listening skills. It sounds so basic, right? But like true respect and really being able to listen to and sort of realize like what the benefits of each of the different disciplines can be, I think is what makes it really interesting. I also recognize it's not always going to work with everyone, right? I think until there's a benefit to having process, and part of that is that it helps us to kind of get aligned on things, even if we personally may have differences of opinion. I think that's one of the reasons why right now it may feel like there are two parallel paths that butt heads. And I think finding it's not creating a Frankenstein, but finding some sort of shared problem solving methods or frameworks or ways of thinking, I think can also contribute to that, because it gives us the sort of the fancy term is a boundary object. It gives us something to share that we can both take different things away from. that can be sort of a transdisciplinary help. So again, a really good question, because I think increasingly that will be important to solve. It's not just throwing people in a room and thinking they're going to get along. Problem solving is tough work. And so being able to sort of trust and build off of what each discipline gives, I think is kind of key to that.
Most definitely. And then we have another question asking, could you again explain the difference between plausible and probable futures?
Yeah. And that idea, by the way, this futures cone, if anyone is interested in it, I always find it just like a very interesting way to sort of expand on what it is that we're thinking about. So if you think of what a probable future is, it's like the high likelihood, right? Like based on what we know, these are the most likely things that are going to happen. So probable futures tend to be much more data-based. They're based on kind of what we already know and what we can build on. And so we have a sense of like, oh, this is what worked in the past. This is what is likely to happen. So the probability, it gives us a narrower angle, if you will, in that kind of cone metaphor, because they're just, we're basing on what we know. And so that sort of feeds that. The notion of plausibility is more about like, well, that could happen. And it may be a low likelihood. So we're not necessarily dealing with like the black swan kind of thing, but it means that there is almost a bit of a suspension of disbelief, that it forces us to get concrete, not about what we already know, but about like, well, what are some things that we're actually not planning for that could be like a plausible outcome? So they may be a bit unexpected, but they're not completely out there. And the reason that plausible space is what is often very useful in situations like scenario planning is that it forces us to be concrete about things that we may not have on our immediate radar. So it's in a sense, it's a little bit of that, like you don't know what you don't know kind of thing, where you can't necessarily fully plan for things, but you're recognizing that there are things beyond what previous data is telling us might happen that we actually might need to consider, but are not so far beyond the sort of likelihood that it's like, it's, to some extent, COVID-19 way beyond plausible until we were almost at the doorstep of it, right? But the notion like, oh, we know that pandemics happen. Like we didn't know the timing of it, but even the notion of a pandemic is sort of a plausible occurrence. It just so happens that like we couldn't have predicted that in a specific way. So it's really, I think it's more about degrees of likelihood and about, the degree to which previous data and previous knowledge informs where we think we are going versus what could be happening.
Wonderful. And I think we have time for one more question. I know we're 3 minutes away from our end time together. So Stephen here says, really like the idea of choice infrastructure. Curious how that approach would fit into traditional consulting relationships, given the existing processes and finite time horizon of a consulting project. Is it possible to excavate and explore foundations in that applied context?
That's a really, again, a wonderful question. I think that the notion of choice infrastructure, I think for me came as a sort of response to the notion of choice architecture, which tends to be much more kind of distinct. And it is in some ways what we are deliberately building. I did think that the notion of choice infrastructure is actually a useful construct in all sorts of conversations, because in some ways it may not be creating wholly new things. Right. So I used as an example, I think this idea of a financial address, which like, okay, that doesn't exist yet. So we would need to invent something to allow that to happen. But choice infrastructure can also just be like, we have internet connectivity. So actually a really interesting example, I think probably we can all agree that like the vaccine was an amazing scientific achievement. The vaccine sign-up system was a completely horrible user experience achievement. Like it just didn't work very well. But that still relied on existing infrastructure. So that may actually be an interesting example of absolutely like nothing in the way that system worked was 100% new. It was using the internet. It was using the ways in which we, health systems needed to connect. The execution of it was pretty poor. But the infrastructure itself and what allowed people to do it, you could imagine using that infrastructural basis to create a much better designed experience would be an instance of sort of taking what is already existent. I'd say choice infrastructure doesn't have to be net new. It can be, and really should be like leveraging what's already there. So yeah, I think integrating it into consulting, problem solving, just a sort of a general notion, is one way that, yeah, we don't have to feel like we're creating everything from scratch, because oftentimes that is not efficient, in fact.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Schmidt. This was wonderful. We're getting a lot of feedback on their chat and email, and want to thank you for your time today. We have recorded this session, so please follow us on Twitter at HarvardBIG. When the recording becomes available, we will post it. And with that, we want to thank you so much, and we'll see you next time.
Excellent. It was my pleasure. This was fantastic. Thank you for having me.
Of course. Thank you all. Thank you, Sarah.
Thanks so much.
Bye.
Thank you.